To quote from the official German translation of the history of the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union, the fascist chain dog, raised on American dollars and English pounds, felt strong enough to break definitely with its patrons and throw himself on them. Well, in this video we'll look at the Soviet perspective of the invasion of Poland in 1939 by the Soviet Union. And spoilers, according to their official history, it was not an invasion. Now you probably ask, what are my sources for this video? Well, I got the official German translation of the history of the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union, which was published originally in Russian from 1960 to 1965, and subsequently by the German Democratic Republic from 1962 to 1968 in German. And as you heard in the teaser, the rhetoric of that time was quite edgy. First, a few notes on sources, then a short look at the current academic Western view about the Soviet invasion of Poland, and then the Soviet perspective. About the source situation, the Soviets published the history of the Great Patriotic War in Russian. Yet the German version was actually a bit altered, and not just due to issues with translation. There were various statements in the original version that were obviously wrong. For instance, it was a publication in which more German submarines were sunk in the Baltic Sea alone than existed, and a statement in fascist Germany intended to take immediate action against the USSR after the invasion of Poland had to be corrected by deletion. This, of course, could lead to some obvious problems. In order to prevent the German and Soviet versions from being played off against each other, the solution was devised of using an imaginary second Russian edition, which was not published at all, as a model for the German text. Hardly had the agreed corrections been made in 1962 when, as a result of the 12th Communist Party of the Soviet Union Party Congress, the original Soviet version was changed and Molotov, for example, disappeared. As such, some aspects in my German version are different from the Russian original or better originals. So this video can only cover one of the various Soviet perspectives on the Second World War. Now I should add here that in historiography a new or different version is not necessarily wrong or bad, since new sources, new research, new questions and new interpretations can bring new insights. Yet, if the perspective is different to solely fit the narrative, that is of course a completely different beast. Finally, a minor aspect. You will notice that in the translation Second World War is not capitalized. This is not an error. In East Germany, Zweiter Weltkrieg, Second World War was not seen as a proper noun. In contrast to Western Germany or Austria, where it is Zweiter Weltkrieg capitalized, as such, sticking close to the original, I did not capitalize the word either in the translation. For the current Western perspective of the Soviet invasion of Poland, I will mostly stick to Alexander's Hill book on the Red Army in the Second World War. Be aware that Mr. Hill can read Russian and visited the Russian archives. As you probably know, on the 1st September 1939 the Wehrmacht invaded Poland. For more information on that, check out my video on it. Now about the Soviet invasion. Hill states that according to a Ukrainian historian, on the 3rd September the Soviet Commissar of Defense ordered the military Soviets of 7 districts to increase the military readiness of their troops. Measures like this included recalling the commanders and political workers from vacation and preventing conscripts in their final year of service to be released as reserves. This was followed on 6 September by orders for a partial secret mobilization, justified by large-scale training exercises, to begin the following day, meaning that mobilization would be conducted without fanfare. On 8 September, orders has been given to the Belarusian and Kiev special military districts for deployment of troops towards the Polish border. On 11 September, the military districts became fronts, which is roughly an equivalent to an army group. 3 days later, on the 14th September, the Ukrainian front was ordered to be ready on the 16th to cross the international border into Poland. The mobilization was quite chaotic, with traffic jams and problems with railway scheduling. Similarly, mobilizing reservists was also an issue. This could lead to deficiency in the mobilization state. For instance, a few days before the invasion, one front had 90% of its personnel mobilized, but only 50% of its automotive transports. Other issues were that at least one unit received far more trucks of one type, but too few of another type. This was of course particularly a problem with special trucks like tankers. Hill notes, many of the formations that did cross the border on the 17th September were nonetheless far from ready for combat, lacking personnel, equipment, and even whole subunits. Hence on 16th September, 13th Rifle Corps' 99th Rifle Division, that was part of one of the assault groups leading the advance into Poland, had neither its regular 71st Artillery Regiment nor the 3 artillery batteries assigned to support its 3 rifle regiments. It also did not have its required tank and engineer battalion or supply train assigned to its 197th Rifle Regiment. Then, on the 17th September 1939, Soviet troops moved into eastern Poland, which for the Soviets was western Ukraine and Belarus. Polish resistance was limited, since significant Polish forces had been destroyed by the Wehrmacht prior to the Soviet invasion, and of course were also mostly located in central Poland as well. In addition, the commander-in-chief of the Polish army, Marshal Edward Śmigły-Rydz, had on the 17th September ordered the Polish army not to fight the Soviets except in case of their attack or attempts to disarm our units, with Polish units to head for Romania and Hungary by the shortest routes, and to negotiate with Soviet forces over passage. This order seems to have reached at least some Polish army units. Furthermore, there was some confusion on the Polish side if the Red Army entered as a conquering force or to assist them against the Wehrmacht. Yet despite the confusion, the order and the dire situation of the Polish forces, some Polish units did resist. Particularly the Polish border troops that were also not under the authority of the army command, put up a fight frequently. Although these troops only had about 11,000 men, in contrast, a regular Polish infantry division had an authorized strength of about 16,500 men. Nevertheless, also regular Polish units fought against the Red Army. One of the most significant clashes between Polish and Soviet forces happened during the defense of Grodno, between the 20th and 22nd September 1939. Elements of the Soviet 27th Tank Brigade tried to take the town without infantry support. Polish army units and civilians described as Boy Scouts by the Polish and youths by Soviet sources defended the town. According to Soviet sources, 19 tanks and 4 armored cars were lost. The Red Army had many problems during the campaign that stemmed from different factors. One major problem was the short notice for the mobilization of the Red Army units. Another problem was the poor reconnaissance, which was further hampered by lack of radios. Poor reconnaissance to a certain degree can be limited by being more cautious. Yet the Red Army tried to advance as fast as possible. This speed seems to have been motivated as much by political concerns as military. Where it was politically undesirable that the Soviet Union be given vast tracts of territory under the terms of the Nazi-Soviet Pact that had recently been conquered by German forces. The Soviet desire to take Lvov was a case in point. Furthermore, it seems that the Red Army units and formations generally advanced rather dispersed and could not mutually support each other. Hill notes with reference to an NKVD report, with units moving forward in columns with intervals of 10 to 15 km between them, without the columns having communications with each other, and with headquarters units not in position to command given poor communications and they're often being separated from subordinate units. Various problems with transport equipment supply and organization likely were the reason why artillery was mainly used in a direct or semi-direct fire role. The Soviets suffered comparatively low losses, about 2,600 according to Weinberg, although considering the odds and situation, Hill notes, however, even if we make some allowance for the fact that Soviet units had little time to prepare for this specific operation, that does not solely explain how such overwhelming force suffered the losses it did where its opponent actually committed only a fraction of the limited forces available to combat. The unpredictable nature of Polish resistance certainly made what was ostensibly a traditional military campaign more complicated, where Soviet's account suggests many Polish units were encountered that did simply surrender. So now let us look at what the history of the Great Patriotic War notes about the whole affair. For this we look at the first book, titled the preparation and unleashing of the Second World War by the imperialist powers. And it's quite interesting how the book is structured and as such frames the perspective. The 5th chapter deals with the beginning of the Second World War. Section 1 is titled The Invasion of Poland by Fascist Germany. Yet there I found no mention of the Soviet invasion at all. And section 2 deals with the time after the fall of Poland and the invasion of Western and Northern Europe. So where is the Soviet invasion of Poland covered? Well, this is done in chapter 6 with the title The Expansion of the Soviet Family of Nations and the USSR's Measures to Secure its Borders. Here we find in section 2 the liberation of the West Ukraine and West Belarus. Now let us look closer at the content. Be aware that I only occasionally comment on the validity of the statements or provide further context. First off, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is mentioned, yet not the secret protocols that arranged the Soviet and German spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. The pact is solely portrayed as a defensive measure. Under such conditions, the Soviet Union had no other way out than to conclude a non-aggression pact with Germany. This pact prevented the formation of a united anti-Soviet front of the capitalist powers and secured peace for the Soviet Union for nearly 2 years, which it badly needed for the further building of socialism and the strengthening of its defensive power. Similarly, it is also noted that the Polish government prepared a war of conquest against the Soviet Union. All the actions of the Polish government on the eve of the Second World War served to prepare for this adventure. In 1938 and 1939, when the political crisis in Europe was maturing, it participated in the aggression of fascist Germany against Czechoslovakia and planned conquer Lithuania and the Soviet part of Ukraine. There's a certain pattern throughout the text, which goes along the lines that leaders like politicians and civil servants were the bad guys, while regular people, namely workers and farmers, were the good guys. Along these lines, the motivations of the Soviets are usually portrayed in a way that either the bad guys were opposed and or the good guys were supported. A good example is the stated motivation for the Soviets to move its troops into Poland, namely, in mid-September 1939, a situation arose in Poland which forced the Soviet government to be particularly concerned about the safety of the Ukrainians and Belarusians residing there. The Polish rulers had abandoned them and the entire Polish people to their fate. On the 17th September 1939, after the Polish government had fled to Romania and the Polish state had disintegrated, the USSR government instructed the Red Army High Command to let the Ukrainian and Belarusian fronts advance to the western borders of western Ukraine and western Belarus in order to take the lives and property of the local population under their protection. As such, the whole operation is called a liberation operation. When the liberation operation of the Red Army began, the German troops had already reached the Western Bug and the San. In places they had already crossed the rivers. It was not certain whether they would stop the advance. Note that the area east of the River San, according to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was in the Soviet area. The justification is further outlined with the following statements. The troops, as well as the civilians, especially civil servants, together with the Polish landowners and colonists, had in a short time literally carried away all the property and a large part of the food of the Ukrainian and Belarusian peasants. Their protests were cruelly suppressed. Many peasants fled to USSR to save themselves from the persecution of the Polish gendarmes and colonists. It is rather apparent that the victims and perpetrators are clearly lined along class lines. If you wonder about the term colonists, this is about Poles that were sent into regions with a majority of Ukrainian and Belarusians. For instance, like some of the areas that were seated in the Treaty of Riga 1921 after the Polish-Soviet War. Another part notes that immediate action was necessary to provide the population with food and other goods of daily use. Finally, it is also noted that stopping the Germans, which are often called fascists, was also part of the motivation. It was a real liberation campaign. Its aim was to liberate the population of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus and to prevent the fascists from advancing further east. This is later repeated with the statement that the Soviet people already in the first weeks of the Second World War did hinder the Germans in their conquest. In terms of organizations and objectives, there's quite some information provided. namely the composition of the Belarusian and Ukrainian front is listed and their destinations as well. The commander-in-chief of the Belarusian front, without waiting for a complete concentration of Soviet troops on the Polish border, formed 3 mobile groups: the Polozok, the Minsk, and the Terchinsk groups. The Polozok group, the 4th Rifle Corps, the 5th Rifle Division, the 24th Cavalry Division, and the 22nd and 25th Armored Brigades, was to occupy first the Sviziania Mikhailovsky area and then the Vilnius area by evening of September 18, 1939. The Minsk group, the 16th Rifle Corps, the 3rd Cavalry Corps, and the 6th Armored Brigade was to occupy the Osimiana Ivi area at the end of the same day and then advance towards Grodno. The Cherkasynsk group, the 5th Rifle Corps, the 6th Cavalry Corps, the 15th Armored Corps, and the 21st Armored Brigade was to reach Skastara at the end of 18 September 1939 and then advance further against Volkovysk. Meanwhile, for the other front, the troops of the Ukrainian front were already fully concentrated on the Polish border at the beginning of the liberation campaign. The War Council of the Ukrainian front instructed them to reach the Kovel-Volodzimierets-Sokal line by the end of September 20, 1939, and then to advance further to the Sun. In order to achieve a rapid pace of advance, each army formed a mobile detachment. It was composed of armored and cavalry formation or elements. It is noted that both fronts were instructed to avoid frontal engagements, enemies should be flanked and attacked from the rear. Additionally, villages should be liberated quickly and preserved from destruction. Among enemies were listed Polish troops, colonist gangs, and gendarmes. The start of the operation is given with 17 September at 0540 hours. It is noted that the inhabitants of the Belarusian and Ukrainian towns and villages greeted the Red Army with enthusiasm. Which brings us to the next part, namely the accounts about Polish resistance or its absence and how they were treated. The elements of the regular Polish army, including the student officers, laid down their arms. The soldiers of the Ukrainian and Belarusian nationality were immediately discharged home. All other military personnel were left free to stay and build a new life with the working people of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, to return to their homeland occupied by the Germans or to go abroad. These statements are rather eerie if one knows about the mass shootings of Polish officers and the intelligentsia by the Soviet NKVD. The mass shootings of 21,857 Polish citizens in Katyn, Starobielsk, and other camps in 1940 was one high watermark of Soviet exterminationist violence against occupied populations. Returning to the Soviet perspective, about the resistance of Polish troops and citizens, it is noted, a small part of Polish troops, colonists and gendarmerie refused to lay down arms. They avoided decisive clashes with the Red Army and sought refuge in isolated groups in forests and larger settlements. They hoped that there would be an armed conflict between the USSR and Germany. Some of their leaders negotiated with the German leadership for the surrender of Ukrainian and Belarusian towns without a fight on the condition of a joint struggle against Soviet troops. At one point, there's a short summary in terms of data that notes the operation of the Red Army lasted for 12 days, in which it moved 250 to 350 kilometers to the west and liberated an area of 190,000 square kilometers. Interestingly enough, this paragraph is followed about the statement that the Soviet foreign minister made in the end of October 1939. Particularly interesting is the statement by Molotov about the cooperation between Germany and the Soviet Union. On October 31, 1939, Molotov described the liberation campaign of the Red Army as a blow, which together with the thrust of the German troops had led to the disintegration of the Polish state, the monstrosity of the Versailles Treaty. This assessment was at odds with the historical truth and the goals of the liberation campaign. The bourgeoisie landlord Poland had already disintegrated in the first days of the German-Polish War. Considering that the German-Soviet troops held a joint parade in Brest-Litovsk on the 22nd September 1939, it seems that Molotov's statement was probably closer to the historical truth. Then again, what do I know? After all, I'm neither a farmer nor a worker. Well, I hope you liked this excursion in the Soviet view on the invasion of Poland in 1939, with some original Cold War rhetoric. Thank you to Eric Dennis Strohmeyer-Wimmer for helping out with sources and questions. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script. Special thanks to all my supporters for making trips to museums and military archives possible. As always, sources in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.